Picture yourself within the cold stone walls of a sprawling castle, watching the hustle and bustle of the courtyard below. Above, heavy wooden beams creak and groan as torches flicker in their brackets. The air smells of wet stone, with a faint trace of animal musk. A world far removed from anything you know now. It's harsh, it's unforgiving, and the people who lived through it had to fight for every scrap of comfort. Now, you probably won't survive this. Back then, the life expectancy of a woman wasn't much to cheer about. Many didn't make it past childbirth or the difficult years that followed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there, so drop your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the moment you were born, your life was practically mapped out in the Middle Ages. If you were a girl, there wasn't much flexibility. No soaring dreams of being an astronaut or taking over the world with some grand business idea. Life for you was mostly about survival. The first thing you likely encountered, even before your first breath, was a world of harsh expectations. Childhood, especially for girls, was fleeting. By the time you were around 7 years old, you'd already begun taking on household chores. If you were from a noble family, you might have had a bit more luxury, but your life still wouldn't be your own. You'd be schooled in the feminine arts, sewing, cooking, managing a household. And if you were lucky, you might have learned a little bit about reading and writing. But most women didn't even have access to education. It wasn't about intellectual freedom, it was about preparing for a life of service. You see, medieval women didn't get to choose their futures or really their destinies. If you were born into wealth, your life would be shaped around managing a large estate, raising children, and staying loyal to your husband. But the one thing every woman could count on was that her life would likely be full of hard labour. Being a woman in the medieval period didn't give you much leeway. Your survival, your happiness, and your success all depended on the whims of the men around you. And let's talk about that. There was no such thing as a romantic marriage back then, not for most women anyway. Marriages were arranged, usually by your father or male relatives, with the best interests of the family, wealth, and political alliances in mind. Your feelings? Irrelevant. Marrying someone you loved was a luxury that few women ever experienced. You might have been 14 years old, betrothed to a man who was much older and already had a reputation, but that was simply the way things worked. This wasn't a world for young love, it was a world of survival. The moment you got married, your life took a completely different turn. You were no longer just a daughter under your father's rule. Now you were a wife, and that meant your life was ruled by your husband. This could mean anything from managing the household to, in some cases, overseeing the entire castle if your husband was away. You were the heartbeat of the home, but at the same time, you were also bound by strict societal rules. Imagine this for a second. You wake up early in the morning, the sun is barely rising, and you're expected to get up, put on your heavy restrictive clothing, and start your duties. No time for rest, no time for pampering. Your household's daily operations were on your shoulders. You managed everything: the servants, the meals, the garden, the children. And yet, you had little authority over your own life. Your husband might be away at war, or he might be running the estate, but that didn't change the fact that your primary duty was to him. This wasn't just about helping your husband. It was about your role as a servant to the estate. Your life, your responsibilities, your goals, all of them were dictated by the needs of the household. And don't forget about your children. You had to raise them, of course, and if you were lucky you had help, but there was little respite. Medieval women were expected to keep the home running smoothly, regardless of the personal toll it took. Even your health was controlled by society's expectations. The idea of personal well-being, or the luxury of taking time off, was unheard of. You didn't have access to the kind of healthcare we have today, and childbirth was a gamble. Complications during childbirth were common, and many women didn't survive the process. Even if you did survive, the aftermath could still be disastrous. Childbirth wasn't something you could plan for. It was a risk you took every time you brought a new life into the world. But what made it worse was that you were often on your own when dealing with it. The midwife might be the only support you had during labour, and even then, it was a dangerous time. Without the modern knowledge we take for granted today, women in medieval times faced a level of danger during childbirth that makes you grateful for today's medical advancements. Historians still argue whether the Church's control over women's roles in society had more of a positive or negative impact. Some say the Church provided stability and protection for women, while others argue that it reinforced oppressive gender roles, limiting women's freedoms even further. Either way, the Church played a massive part in defining a woman's role in medieval society. You were expected to be modest, virtuous, and above all, submissive. Sexuality, especially, was something that medieval women had no control over. The Church had its own rules about women's bodies, and society had its own standards. Whether you liked it or not, your sexuality was often weaponized. A woman's virginity was seen as the most precious thing she could offer in marriage. Once you were married, however, you were expected to produce heirs, and the pressure was intense. If you didn't, your position in society could suffer. But let's not get too bleak just yet. While life for medieval women was hard, they were not entirely powerless. Though the narrative often focuses on their limitations, there were moments of defiance and strength. Some women, through sheer force of will, managed to carve out spaces where they could exert power, whether in their households, in their communities, or, on rare occasions, in political circles. But these were the exceptions. For most, life was a constant struggle against the confines of their time. And there's one other thing to note. Medieval women, while often relegated to the background of history, weren't entirely invisible. Their lives, their struggles, and their contributions, even if small or overshadowed by the men around them, are still part of the rich tapestry that makes up our past. Without their efforts, the medieval world would have crumbled. So, remember that, next time you think about medieval life. Despite the harshness, despite the rules and restrictions, women were central to it all. Now let's take a step back in time to the very beginning of a medieval woman's life, childhood. If you were born a girl in the medieval era, things weren't exactly rosy. In fact, you probably didn't have the luxury of enjoying the innocence or freedom that modern children get. Your existence, as harsh as it may sound, was dictated by societal norms that didn't have much regard for your personal well-being. In the Middle Ages, a girl's future was pretty much sealed from birth, and it wasn't a future of grand adventures or open opportunities. Imagine yourself, a young girl, the moment you open your eyes to the world. You can barely hold your head up as your family looks down at you with both hope and dread. Hope because you're the new addition to the family, the child that will hopefully grow strong and healthy. And dread because, well, life for a girl wasn't going to be easy. You see, there were high expectations placed on you from day one. In fact, just surviving the early years of life was a challenge. Without the medical advancements we have today, many children, boys and girls alike, didn't make it past infancy. But the odds were stacked even more heavily against girls. Why? Because girls were expected to do things that boys weren't, namely, become wives and mothers. From the moment you were born, your role was more or less decided for you. If you were born into a noble family, there might be a glimmer of hope for a slightly different path. Perhaps you could become a lady-in-waiting, or play a role in the court. But if you were born into a common family, your life was likely going to be spent either working in the fields, or once you reached a certain age, married off to a man chosen by your father. The concept of finding yourself was foreign. There was no time for self-discovery. You were there to serve the family, and your worth was measured by how well you fulfilled that role. By the time you were around 6 or 7, life began to pick up speed. It wasn't the kind of childhood that involved playing freely or learning for the sake of curiosity. Instead, it was a childhood full of chores and lessons designed to prepare you for marriage and motherhood. If you were a noble woman, the kind of education you received was likely focused on manners, reading, writing, and household management. For most girls, the luxury of formal education was a dream that would never materialise. Instead, you would learn from your mother, your aunts, other women in the household how to run a home, how to cook, clean, manage servants, and of course, bear children. While boys were encouraged to pursue skills that might lead to leadership or even military prowess, girls were trained in the skills needed to maintain the home and keep the family running smoothly. You were taught to be the backbone of the household, expected to step up when needed, take care of the sick, and raise children. If you were born into a higher status family, you might be taught how to run a manor, deal with the estate's finances, or oversee a group of servants. But again, the end goal was always the same, to be a wife and a mother, or in some cases, a nun. And let's not even get started on the rules and restrictions placed on your behaviour. Even as a child, you were expected to behave with dignity and modesty, as a reflection of your family's honour. Any sort of misstep, even something as innocent as a playful act, could bring shame upon your family. Your behaviour wasn't just your own, it was a reflection of your parents, your community, and your social standing. But what if you didn't meet those expectations? What if you were, say, a little too independent or too curious for your own good? Well, the consequences could range from being labelled as a troublemaker to being outright punished. For girls, the concept of independence wasn't something celebrated. It was a dangerous idea that could disrupt the delicate balance of the social order. Instead, you were taught to be obedient and compliant, especially in matters of marriage. Your future was planned for you long before you were old enough to even understand the concept of love. Historians still argue whether this early training was done out of necessity or a desire for control. Some argue that it was simply the practical realities of a harsh world, where a woman's survival depended on her ability to be resourceful and self-sufficient. Others argue that this early training was designed to instill a sense of submission, ensuring that women understood their place in society and never strayed from it. In either case, it's clear that women were expected to fulfill roles that had been preordained for them. As a girl in medieval times, you weren't exactly encouraged to dream. You weren't encouraged to think for yourself. Your value, whether you liked it or not, was tied to your ability to perform domestic tasks and ultimately bear children. If you were lucky, you might have a chance at some minor education, or the ability to manage an estate. But for the vast majority of women, the future was largely about preparing to be a good wife and mother, nothing more, nothing less. In the eyes of society, a girl's life was like a puzzle with only one solution: marriage. And that's the end goal for every medieval girl, whether she liked it or not. The harsh reality was that girls didn't have the privilege of questioning the roles that were set out for them. There was no time for rebellion or self-determination. You were raised to serve, and you were expected to do so without complaint. That was life as a medieval girl, and for most women there was no other option. But of course, not every girl's life followed this exact pattern. While the majority of medieval women lived under the thumb of societal expectations, there were some who managed to carve out different paths. Some women defied expectations and found ways to become literate, join convents, or take on leadership roles within their communities. However, these women were the exception, not the rule. For the vast majority, childhood was nothing more than the preparation for a future that was already mapped out for them. Now, imagine the very thought of your life being determined for you from birth. Your future was decided not by you, but by the men around you, and your only task was to fulfill that role. From the time you could walk and talk, your only goal was to prepare for marriage and motherhood. And while some may argue that women had more power in certain respects, by managing the household or overseeing the family estate, it's hard to deny that, at its core, being a woman in medieval times was about survival. Your future, your hopes and your dreams were secondary to the needs of the family and society. It wasn't all bad, of course. There were moments of joy, of fulfillment, of love, but these were few and far between. Your primary role was to help the family thrive, even if it meant sacrificing your own happiness. And so, as a young girl in the medieval period, you learned to keep your head down, do your work, and prepare for a life of service. That was your purpose, and that was all you could expect. And as for the dreams you might have had, well, there was something to be quietly tucked away, never to be spoken of again. But this was only the beginning. As you grew older, life became even more challenging. What awaited you was the harsh reality of a world where marriage wasn't just about love. It was about survival, power, and maintaining the social order. The next stage of your life would be one of negotiation, compromise, and ultimately compliance. Step forward a little bit now past your childhood and look at the most significant and often the most difficult moment in a medieval woman's life: marriage. If you thought childhood was tough, just wait until you get to the part where you're handed over to another man, usually without a second thought for your own wishes, desires, or well-being. Marriage wasn't about love or mutual attraction back then. It was about survival. It was a contract, a way of ensuring that you and your family were provided for. When it came to the decision of who you would marry, you were, in a very real sense, at the mercy of your father or male guardians. You didn't have a say in it. Your destiny was being decided by those around you, usually based on how well your family could improve its position or secure its wealth through a strategic marriage. The concept of romantic love was, for the most part, foreign to this process. Your marriage was more like a business arrangement than anything else, and while some families did care about compatibility, it wasn't a primary concern. The key was alliance, stability, and ensuring the continuation of your family line. Think about this for a second. You're around the age of 12 or 13, maybe 14, and your father tells you that you're to marry a man you've never met. He might be older, he might be wealthier, and he might already have a reputation that precedes him, but none of that matters. What matters is that this marriage secures the family's position in society. What matters is that it ensures the survival of your father's estate and keeps your family's name respected among the nobility. So, at an age when most modern girls are just starting to figure out who they are, you're expected to begin your role as a wife, and likely a mother. If you're from a higher status family, you might have been trained in the finer points of courtly behaviour, how to speak, how to conduct yourself in front of others, and how to be the perfect lady. But none of this training prepared you for the reality of marriage. The expectations were not only social, but very personal. As a medieval wife, you were expected to provide your husband with heirs, preferably male. Your worth was measured by your ability to bear children. This was not a partnership based on affection or emotional connection. It was a business transaction. Your role was clear: provide heirs, keep the household in order, and support your husband's ambitions. Simple as that. The wedding day, of course, was an event. It wasn't about you, though. It wasn't a celebration of your love or happiness. It was about making a public declaration of your family's union, a sign that your father had secured your future, and perhaps more importantly, a way to ensure that your family's wealth or land didn't slip into someone else's hands. The ceremony was often a grand affair, with lavish feasts, costly gifts, and elaborate rituals. But none of this made the reality of your new life any easier. Now, instead of being under the thumb of your father, you were under the thumb of your husband. This was just the beginning. Historians still debate whether marriage in the medieval period was as harsh for women as it is often portrayed. Some argue that medieval marriages had a certain level of partnership, especially for women in the upper echelons of society, where women sometimes had real influence over their husbands' decisions. Others contend that, in most cases, women were completely subjugated by the terms of marriage, expected to carry out their roles without question or complaint. Either way, one thing was clear: a medieval woman's life was defined by marriage, whether she liked it or not. Now let's take a closer look at what being a wife in the medieval world really meant. It wasn't just about being a companion or a partner. Your role was far more complex and far less glamorous than we often imagine. You were expected to manage the household, which included everything from overseeing the servants to preparing meals, making sure that the daily chores were done, and ensuring that your husband's every need was met. If your husband was away, you were in charge of keeping everything running smoothly. You were also expected to represent the family in public, maintaining the family's honour and reputation. And of course, there was the matter of your children. If you were fortunate enough to survive childbirth, you would probably find yourself pregnant again within a short time. Medieval women gave birth to many children, and it wasn't uncommon to lose a child in infancy or during childbirth itself. The pressure to produce heirs was enormous. Having a son, in particular, was considered the highest achievement of a medieval wife, for the son would inherit the family's wealth and land. If you failed in this regard, it could be seen as a failure on your part, and there were few things worse than being labelled a failure in a time when your worth was tied directly to your ability to fulfil your reproductive duties. But even if you did produce children, your life was still a far cry from the romanticised version we often see in movies or books. Being a medieval wife was about hard work, constant vigilance, and a never-ending list of responsibilities. And while you had some influence over the household, your power was limited. Your husband was the head of the family, and his word was law. You were expected to support him, to manage the home, and to raise the children. You had little autonomy, and any decision you made had to be approved by him. Your relationship with your husband was often dictated more by practicality than by affection. Many medieval marriages, especially among the lower classes, were arranged to ensure economic stability. Love, in the romantic sense, had little to do. Your role was one of service, and while there might have been moments of affection and mutual respect, they were fleeting at best. Your primary duty was to serve your husband and your children, and if you failed in any way, there were consequences. Even if you were from a noble family, where your status allowed for more freedom and influence, the basic structure of your role didn't change. You were still expected to marry young, produce heirs, and manage the household. You still had to navigate a world that was built around a male hierarchy. And even though you may have had more opportunities for education or involvement in the courtly life, your status as a woman still kept you in a secondary position. Historians still argue whether noble women had it easier or harder than their lower class counterparts. Some claim that being a noble woman offered certain privileges, such as education, and a slightly better quality of life, while others argue that the pressure to marry well, maintain the family's estate and bear heirs placed just as much, if not more, strain on noble women. Either way, the expectations placed on you were clear: marry, serve, bear children, and manage the home. And the harsh reality was that there was little room for deviation from this path. In the medieval world, marriage wasn't a partnership in the sense we think of today. It was a contract, an agreement between families, and you were simply the vehicle through which this contract was fulfilled. The emotional aspects of marriage, the idea of companionship or mutual respect, were secondary to the main goal, ensuring the survival of the family line. But even in this harsh reality, there were moments of strength. Despite the overwhelming societal pressures, many medieval women carved out spaces of influence, whether through their roles as wives, mothers, or even rulers. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine had significant political power. The Queen Isabella of Castile, who played a major role in the Spanish Inquisition, managed to break through the restrictions placed on them. But for the vast majority of women, their lives were more about survival than glory. They were defined by their ability to perform the duties set before them, and their worth was determined by how well they managed the household, bore children, and supported their husbands. And so, in the medieval period, your life as a woman was a balancing act, a constant negotiation between survival, service, and the occasional glimpse of power. The medieval marriage was not about love, but about necessity and the unyielding march of societal expectations. Now that we've explored the complexities of marriage, let's dive into the daily role of a medieval wife and the type of work she was expected to perform. The duties of a woman in medieval times weren't just limited to keeping the household in order. If you were a wife, your role was far richer. You weren't simply there to management of the home. You were its lifeblood, its core, the one who ensured that everything went smoothly, even when the world outside your castle was chaos. Picture this. You wake up early, before the sun even rises, and the day starts with a list of chores that seems endless. You don't have the luxury of a cup of coffee to kickstart your day. No, Instead, you slip into your heavy, restrictive clothing and begin preparing for the long day ahead. The fire needs stoking, the bread needs baking, the household servants need direction, and the children need tending to. If the husband is away, you take on even more duties, from overseeing the estate's finances to making key decisions regarding the household's welfare. Your days are spent managing food, people, supplies, and the well-being of your family. You might think that a noble woman had an easier life than a commoner, but in truth, the responsibilities were often even more intense. Managing a noble estate meant more than just looking after a few servants. It meant overseeing the land, the crops, and all of the workers involved in maintaining the estate. You were expected to have knowledge of agriculture, economics, and the proper management of your resources. And while the men were out fighting wars or representing the family at court, you were there, holding the family's financial stability in your hands. That meant everything from making sure the servants were working efficiently to ensuring that crops were planted, harvested, and properly sold. There was no room for failure. If you mismanaged even one aspect, it could cost the family its wealth or its land. And if you were a woman from a poorer family, your tasks were equally grueling, but perhaps even more physically demanding. Instead of managing an estate, you might find yourself working the fields alongside your husband, doing back-breaking labour just to make sure your family survived. In addition to these tasks, you still had to manage the household. You were expected to cook, clean, and ensure that your children were raised properly. The workload was unrelenting, and there was little time for rest. The social structure was unforgiving. Women were expected to perform all of these duties while still adhering to strict gender roles that demanded modesty, silence, and submission. The medieval concept of womanly duties wasn't just about running the home. It was about ensuring the survival of your family. In many ways, your role as a wife wasn't just about nurturing and providing love. It was about making sure that your family could survive in a world that was often hostile and unpredictable. You were the manager of your home, its emotional centre and its economic backbone. If the house was well run, if the children were healthy, if the servants were happy and working efficiently, then you were succeeding. If not, you were failing, and your failure would reflect poorly not just on you, but on your entire family. Imagine the pressure you would feel as a woman who was not only responsible for running the home, but also for carrying the emotional weight of an entire household. And yet, despite this, your position was still a precarious one. Even the most noble of women were still bound by social norms that dictated their submission to the men in their lives. If your husband didn't approve of your methods or decisions, there was little you could do. You could manage everything perfectly, but at the end of the day, the final say came from your husband. Your role as a wife wasn't about respect or partnership. It was about fulfilling your duties, and that's what made you valuable. But let's not forget the outside world, the one beyond the castle walls. As a woman, especially if you were of noble birth, your life was often confined to the household. You had little to no freedom to venture out and explore the world as you saw fit. If you went out, it was likely on the arm of your husband or a trusted male relative. You were expected to stay inside, manage the domestic affairs, and let the men handle the more complicated parts. Your presence in public was rare, and when it did happen, it was usually in the form of a very controlled and carefully managed public appearance. You were to look beautiful, composed, and above all else, dignified. Still, there were moments of respite, but these were few and far between. Perhaps you could join a courtly gathering or a feast. Maybe, if you were lucky, you would be invited to some of the more private matters at court, where politics and intrigue took place. However, even in these settings, you were still expected to maintain your role as a dutiful wife, quiet, composed, and submissive. There was little room for you to speak out or voice your opinions. The courtly life, while glamorous in some respects, was still rooted in the very traditional roles that society expected women to fulfill. Historians still argue about the extent of the influence that noble women had in the courtly life of the Middle Ages. Some claim that, while women were often relegated to the background, they still exerted a certain level of influence over their husbands, especially in the management of estates, or the decision-making that affected the family's wealth. Others argue that women's voices were largely suppressed, and any power they wielded was indirect at best. Regardless of the historical debate, one thing is certain. The role of the wife in medieval times was complex. While you were expected to maintain the household, raise the children, and support your husband, you were also living under a veil of constant social expectations, rigid gender roles, and patriarchal control. Now let's look at a more personal, yet equally vital aspect of your life as a medieval wife: your health. Being a woman in the Middle Ages was not for the faint of heart, and childbearing was the most dangerous of all endeavours. Giving birth was not a matter of excitement or joy, but a matter of life or death. Childbirth was a perilous affair, and complications were frequent. Even with the assistance of a midwife, the lack of medical knowledge meant that any number of things could go wrong. And even if you managed to give birth successfully, the recovery was grueling, and there was always the possibility of infection. For women who had multiple children, something that was not only expected but also demanded, this process could take a huge toll on the body. Women were expected to get pregnant, give birth, and recover multiple times over the course of their lives with little rest in between. If you were lucky enough to survive childbirth, you could look forward to raising a large family while still performing all of the other duties expected of you. But if you weren't so lucky, you might find yourself mourning the death of a child, or worse, your own death after a particularly difficult birth. Being a medieval wife wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about the mental and emotional toll that this constant cycle of childbirth, domestic management and submission took on your soul. You were expected to be strong, capable and resilient in the face of it all. But at what cost? And even as you carried out your duties, there was always the looming threat of war or conflict. If your husband went to war, you would be left to manage the household on your own. While men were fighting for glory and power, you were left to tend to the estate and ensure that the family's interests were protected. There were no vacations, no breaks, and no safety nets. You were responsible for everything, and if something went wrong, you would be held accountable. But despite all this, women managed to hold things together. They kept households running, managed estates, cared for children, and provided emotional support for their husbands. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but medieval wives were the backbone of society. They were the unsung heroes of the medieval world, doing the difficult and often thankless work that allowed the men in their lives to pursue their goals. Now we turn our attention to perhaps the most crucial, yet perilous aspect of a medieval woman's life: childbearing. For medieval women, giving birth was not a joyful occasion. It was a deadly gamble. The act of creating and nurturing life could just as easily lead to your own death, making motherhood a complex mix of excitement and dread. And even though childbirth was a necessity for continuing the family line and securing the future of your estate, the process itself was fraught with danger, uncertainty, and deep emotional strain. Let's start with the basics. Pregnancy and childbirth were far more perilous in medieval times than we can even begin to imagine. Without the medical knowledge or equipment we take for granted today, every pregnancy carried the risk of fatal complications. Whether it was excessive bleeding, infection, or a malpositioned baby, there was always the real possibility that something would go wrong. Midwives were the primary attendants at births, but their understanding of anatomy was rudimentary, and they often had no more than traditional remedies to rely on. Even the most experienced midwives could do little to help when a birth went wrong. As a medieval woman, pregnancy was something you had to endure multiple times, as it was expected that you would bear many children, at least enough to ensure the survival of the family line. The toll on your body, year after year, was immense. After each birth, your body would take time to heal, but it was never truly given the chance to recover before you were expected to be pregnant again. It was not uncommon for women to have 10, 15, or more children during their lifetime, each birth placing additional strain on their physical and mental health. Imagine the exhaustion you'd feel after several years of childbearing. There were no such things as maternity leave or any sort of support system, and the physical demands of childbirth left you little time to rest. The recovery period after birth was lengthy and painful, but you were expected duties, caring for your home, raising your children, and managing the household, all while your body was still recovering from the trauma of childbirth. Complications in childbirth were common, and the threat of death was ever present. Many women died in childbirth or shortly after due to infections, hemorrhages, or other complications. The survival rate for women giving birth during the Middle Ages was dismal. Even though many women underwent multiple pregnancies, the very act of bearing children was a constant risk. It wasn't just the mothers who were at risk. Infant mortality was also incredibly high. Many babies didn't survive beyond their first year of life, leaving mothers to grieve the loss of their children, adding yet another layer of heartbreak to the already difficult realities of childbirth. There were also the social and cultural pressures surrounding childbirth. For a medieval woman, the act of bearing a male heir was of utmost importance. Sons were the ones who inherited family wealth and land, and without one, a woman's status and value could be severely diminished. If you failed to produce a male heir, your position within the family could be questioned, and you might even face ridicule. The pressure to give birth to a male heir weighed heavily on every medieval woman. Your worth was tied directly to your ability to produce heirs, and the fear of failing in this task was a constant companion. But childbirth wasn't just a private affair. It was an event that could affect the entire family, especially if you were of noble birth. The birth of a child was seen as a public event, and the birth of a male heir was a source of pride and celebration. The entire community would celebrate the new arrival, especially if it was a boy. The father would often receive congratulations, and the family's wealth and status would be reinforced by the birth. But if the baby didn't survive, it wasn't just a personal loss, it was a public one. The failure to produce a healthy child could be seen as a failure of the mother herself, further adding to the burden on her shoulders. Historians still debate the role of women in childbirth during the medieval period. Some argue that the constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth reinforced a woman's position in society, giving her a purpose and a role within the family. Others contend that it placed undue stress on women and exacerbated the already harsh realities of medieval life. Either way, it's clear that childbirth was central to a medieval woman's existence, and it played a significant role in shaping her life and her identity. However, not all medieval women accepted their role as mere vessels for childbearing. Some women, especially those in the higher echelons of society, were able to assert some level of control over their reproductive choices. For example, some noble women were able to limit the number of children they had, choosing to space out their pregnancies to avoid the physical toll of frequent childbearing. And while they still faced enormous societal pressure to produce heirs, some women managed to exercise a degree of autonomy in how they navigated their roles as mothers. Still, the majority of women had little say in the matter. Their role was clear: bear children, and do it often. The societal expectation was that you would become pregnant, give birth, and raise children, all while performing countless household duties. Your body, your health, and your emotions were secondary to the family's needs. The experience of childbirth wasn't just a personal journey, it was a societal expectation, and women were judged by their ability to fulfill this role. But beyond the physical challenges of childbirth, there was the emotional toll that it took on women. For medieval women, childbirth was often a traumatic experience. The fear of death, the pain of labour, the exhaustion, and the emotional burden of raising children in a harsh, unforgiving world created a psychological strain that few could escape. And when a child didn't survive, the grief could be overwhelming. Women were expected to grieve quietly, to carry on as though nothing had happened, and to keep up with their duties despite the loss. In a time when medical help was limited and the risks of childbirth were so high, it's no wonder that many women lived in a constant state of fear. Every pregnancy could be your last, every birth could be a death sentence. And yet, despite the fear, despite the trauma, medieval women endured. They gave birth, they raised children, and they carried the heavy weight of motherhood on their shoulders. They did so because it was expected of them, because their survival depended on it, and because, for better or for worse, it was the role they were born into. But even as we look at the trials and tribulations of childbirth, we cannot forget the remarkable resilience of medieval women. Despite the dangers, the hardships, and the emotional toll, they continue to bear children, manage households, and ensure the survival of their families. Their ability to persevere, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, speaks to their strength, their determination, and their place in the historical narrative. Now, as we move forward from the challenges of childbirth, we see that medieval women were not merely defined by their ability to reproduce. They played a significant role in the broader social structure, and though their efforts often went unrecognised, they were crucial to the survival and success of their families and communities. As we leave behind the heavy realities of childbirth, it's time to look at a more subtle, but still deeply impactful aspect of medieval life: education. While we like to think of the Middle Ages as a time of great intellectual achievement and learning, for women, education was not a privilege, it was a rarity. Most medieval women didn't have access to the kind of formal education that their male counterparts did. And yet, the role of women in intellectual life, while often neglected in mainstream histories, was not non-existent. Women in the Middle Ages were often educated in the most practical ways possible, learning the skills necessary to manage a household, raise children and support their husbands. But formal education, that was reserved mostly for the men, especially in the upper classes. Imagine this. You're a young girl growing up in a noble family. You live in a grand castle surrounded by luxury and wealth. But despite the privilege of your birth, the future you face is already being dictated by the gender norms of the time. While your brothers receive instruction in Latin, mathematics, and courtly manners, your education is more about preparing you for a life of domesticity. The art of running a household is what's expected of you, learning to sew, cook, manage servants, and oversee the family's estate if your husband is away. While your brothers are encouraged to study history, science, and politics, you're encouraged to learn to be a good wife and mother. There's little room for intellectual curiosity beyond what is necessary for your role in the family. If you were born into a wealthy or noble family, you might have had the chance to learn to read and write, albeit in a limited capacity. But that was the exception, not the rule. Education for women was largely seen as a luxury, an unnecessary distraction from the real work of life. And even in the rare instances where women were taught to read, their education rarely extended beyond the basics of managing a household. There was little to no encouragement for girls to pursue intellectual pursuits such as philosophy or the sciences. It simply wasn't expected of you. However, this wasn't the case for all women. Some women managed to break free from these constraints, although they were far from the norm. Women in religious orders, such as nuns, often had access to libraries and were taught to read and write in Latin. Nuns in particular played a crucial role in preserving knowledge during the medieval period. They transcribed manuscripts, wrote books, and provided education to other women. Some even ran their own convents, with a kind of power and influence that few other women in the medieval world could claim. But for the vast majority of women, access to education was limited, and the intellectual development of women was largely ignored. Historians still debate the extent to which women's education was actively suppressed during the Middle Ages. Some argue that the Church played a significant role in keeping women out of intellectual circles, while others believe that societal norms simply didn't see the value in educating women beyond the basics. Regardless of the reasoning, the result was the same. The majority of women didn't have access to the kind of intellectual development that would have allowed them to pursue careers, intellectual achievements, or even the freedom of thought that men enjoyed. But let's not be too quick to dismiss the educational achievements of medieval women. While formal education may have been out of reach for most, some women managed to assert their intellectual presence in subtle yet powerful ways. For instance, women like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composer and mystic, defied the typical limitations placed on women's intellectual pursuits. She wrote books on medicine, philosophy and theology, and her contributions to music are still celebrated today. Hildegard is just one example of how medieval women, despite their circumstances, found ways to express themselves intellectually and contribute to the world of learning. Even women who didn't manage to write books or contribute to scientific advancement still found ways to wield knowledge in their own unique ways. Many women in noble families were instrumental in the management of large estates, learning the intricacies of agriculture, economics, and finance. They were often the ones who ensured that the estate was running smoothly, while their husbands were away at war or court. They were expected to understand everything from crop cycles to the skills of managing workers, ensuring that the family's wealth and land remained intact. This kind of knowledge was incredibly valuable, but it was often dismissed as practical knowledge rather than intellectual knowledge, and yet there were some who managed to break through the intellectual barriers placed before them. Some women in the church were able to receive training in Latin and were even allowed to teach other women. The convents were some of the only places where women could pursue education in a more formal sense, though this was far from the ideal. Still, some women used their time in the convent to gain access to literature, philosophy and science. The fact that there were even a few women who gained access to this kind of education is a testament to their resilience and determination to find intellectual freedom, even in a society that sought to suppress it. Historians argue over the reasons behind the lack of education for women in the medieval period. Some say that the church was responsible for stifling intellectual development for women, while others argue that the prevailing social structures simply didn't leave room for women to pursue anything beyond domestic life. Either way, it's clear that the majority of women during this time had very limited access to education, and while there were certainly exceptions, the general rule was that women's education was seen as unimportant, at best a luxury, at worst a waste of time. But despite these limitations, many medieval women still found ways to make an intellectual impact. Their contributions may not have been as widely recognised or celebrated as those of their male counterparts, but they were no less significant. Whether in the household, in the convent, or in their roles as political advisors, women played crucial roles in the intellectual and cultural life of the medieval world. Their knowledge, though often hidden, shaped the lives of those around them. So as we move forward in the story of medieval women, remember that education, while limited, was still a valuable tool that some women managed to wield. Whether it was through managing estates, writing books, or preserving knowledge, women of the Middle Ages found ways to push the boundaries of what was expected of them. Historians still debate the lasting effects of medieval education on women. Some argue that it was a necessary stepping stone to women gaining greater access to education in later periods, while others claim that it simply perpetuated the intellectual inequalities between the sexes. Regardless of the argument, the fact remains that women in the Middle Ages were able to gain knowledge and apply it in ways that impacted society, whether publicly or privately. Now that we've discussed the limited scope of formal education for women, let's explore the physical reality of medieval women's lives, which was defined by the oppressive and often exhausting clothing they were required to wear. You might think that a gown would be the most comfortable thing in the world, but in the Middle Ages, clothing was as much a symbol of your status and role in society as it was a practical necessity. And for women, the reality of wearing layers upon layers of fabric was both physically demanding and socially restrictive. Picture this. You're preparing for a day in the medieval court or perhaps a noble gathering. You step into your chamber and begin the process of dressing, a task that would take much longer than you would ever expect. The first layer is a shift, often made from linen that clings to your body, and it's followed by a tight-fitting gown made from wool or silk. But that's not all. On top of your gown, you're expected to wear a heavy, ornate outer layer, often made of fur, velvet or brocade. The gown is weighted down by the sheer amount of fabric, often so much so that it becomes a physical burden. And of course, there's the veil, the headpiece, and sometimes a crown. Everything must be perfectly arranged to reflect your family's status, and you dare not appear without proper decorum. In addition to the heavy materials, the clothing was tightly fitted, often squeezing the body in ways that could lead to discomfort or even health problems. Women wore corsets and bodices that were designed to pull in their waists and emphasize their figures. These garments could cause severe physical strain, including difficulty breathing, restricted movement, and long-term damage to the body. The corsets, in particular, were made of stiff material, sometimes reinforced with whalebone or metal, to ensure that the body conformed to the desired shape. And let's not forget the long sleeves, which could weigh you down and make even simple tasks like eating, writing, or managing household chores more difficult than they had to be. If you were from the upper class, your clothes were a reflection of your wealth and status. You had access to luxurious fabrics and rich, vibrant colours, and your clothing served as a visual marker of your family's place in society. But the irony was that these rich, elaborate clothes often caused you more harm than good. The heavy garments were not just cumbersome, they were also impractical for the realities of a woman's daily life. The heat and discomfort of wearing multiple layers for hours at a time made simple tasks like walking, working, or even breathing more difficult. You might be expected to attend a formal event where you had to remain upright and composed, but all the while you'd be fighting the physical strain of your clothing. If you were from a lower social class, well, your clothes might not be as ornate or heavy, but they still represented the same burdens. While you didn't have the luxury of silk or velvet, you still had to wear layers of wool and linen, and your movement was still restricted. A woman's clothing, regardless of her social status, was always designed to constrain rather than liberate. It was a constant reminder of her role in society, always present, always a part of her identity. It didn't matter if you were working the fields or attending a grand feast. Your clothing had the same function, to reinforce your place in the world. Historians still debate the role of clothing in medieval society. Some argue that the elaborate, restrictive garments were an expression of the era's social hierarchy, where clothing was used as a form of control to reinforce the division between the classes. Others believe that these garments were simply a reflection of the time's cultural values, which saw a woman's appearance as a direct reflection of her family's status. Either way, one thing is clear: women's clothing in the Middle Ages was never just about practicality. It was a tool of both social control and personal expression. Despite the discomfort and restrictions, medieval women had little choice but to conform to these fashion standards. If you were to appear in public without the proper attire, you would be seen as not just rebellious but dishonourable. Modesty was one of the central virtues for women, and your clothing reflected your adherence to these ideals. To go against the expected standards of dress was to risk your reputation and the reputation of your family. Even in the most private moments when you were at home, you would have been expected to wear clothing that adhered to societal norms. Whether at court, in the fields, or in your own home, the weight of societal expectations was always heavy, both literally and figuratively. But clothing in medieval times wasn't just about modesty or social class. It was also a tool of power. Women of higher status used their clothing to communicate their position in the social hierarchy. Their gowns were designed with intricate embroidery, precious stones and rich fabrics to make a statement about their wealth, power, and influence. The more ornate and expensive the fabric, the higher your status was considered to be. It was a form of silent communication, a way to show the world your family's standing without saying a word. And there was also the question of fashion. Though it may seem trivial in the grand scheme of things, medieval women were still concerned with appearance. Fashion trends came and went, and the wealthy were constantly updating their wardrobe to keep up with the latest styles. Women's clothing, especially in the noble classes, was often designed to reflect the changing tastes of the time. And yet, despite the ever-evolving trends, the basic structure of women's clothing remained the same: constrictive, heavy, and designed to keep women within the boundaries set by society. Let's take a moment to think about how this would affect you as a medieval woman over the course of your life. You would spend hours each day in heavy, restrictive clothing, and your every movement would be dictated by how the garments fit and how you were expected to behave. You were not just expected to wear these clothes, you were expected to wear them in a way that conveyed respectability, humility, and honour. The sheer weight of these expectations would have worn you down physically and emotionally. But at the same time, they also provided a form of protection. Your clothing shielded you from the world's gaze, offering you a layer of armour, even as it restricted your every move, Even though the practical and physical challenges of medieval clothing are often overlooked in mainstream history, they played a significant role in shaping the daily lives of women. The heavy, uncomfortable garments were a constant reminder of the social and gender roles that were imposed upon women. They were a visual symbol of the limitations placed on women, both in terms of their physical mobility and their social freedom. But let's not end on a somber note. As uncomfortable as medieval clothing was, it was also a source of pride for many women. The beauty and intricacy of the garments, especially in the wealthier classes, were often admired and envied. And while they might have been a physical burden, they also represented the family's standing, the woman's status, and her role within the community. In many ways, despite all the discomfort, medieval clothing was a symbol of power, a quiet form of rebellion against the limitations placed on women. It was a way for women to express themselves, even in a society that sought to suppress their voices. Historians still debate whether the societal pressures surrounding women's clothing were more restrictive than empowering. Some argue that the fashion of the time was simply a reflection of the era's ideals, while others contend that it was an imposition, a form of control. Regardless of the debate, it's clear that clothing in the Middle Ages was more than just a functional necessity. It was an integral part of a woman's life, serving as both a physical burden and a social symbol. As we move forward from the physical constraints imposed by clothing, let's take a moment to consider another aspect of medieval life for women, their roles at court. The medieval court was a world of politics, power and prestige, but for women, it was also a realm of strict decorum, limited agency and constant scrutiny. The role of women at court, especially those of noble birth, was largely shaped by societal expectations, which emphasized their beauty, elegance and ability to secure political alliances through marriage. But despite the outward glamour, life at court was often confining and frustrating for women, as their power was severely limited by their gender. At court, women were often seen and not heard. They were expected to be the epitome of grace, refinement and decorum, providing an image of perfect femininity that would reflect positively on their families and husbands. A woman's worth at court was not measured by her intellect, ambition, or personal achievements, but by her ability to charm, to look beautiful, and to remain compliant. And while court life might have afforded some women a modicum of influence, often through their relationships with powerful men, this influence was always secondary to the authority of their male counterparts. Picture yourself as a noblewoman, a member of a powerful family, living in a grand castle with all the luxuries that come with it. You've been carefully trained in the arts of conversation, courtly manners, and the expectations of a noblewoman at court. Your purpose at court is not to participate in the political affairs of the day, or make decisions that affect the kingdom, but rather to support your husband, maintain your family's honour, and navigate the delicate balance of court politics. Your influence is limited, often relegated to the role of advisor to your husband, or a silent participant in the decisions made by the male rulers of the court. But even in this constrained environment, women found ways to wield power, though often in subtle and indirect ways. Women who were married to powerful lords or kings often had a say in the political decisions made at court, but this influence was almost always behind the scenes. For example, a queen might influence her husband's decisions or advocate for policies that benefited her family. She would rarely have the authority to act independently. In many ways, the medieval court was a world of alliances, where women were used as tools to strengthen political ties and secure the future of their families. Your beauty, your grace, and your ability to secure an advantageous marriage were your currency. But even this wasn't always enough to provide you with true power. Historians still debate the true nature of women's influence at court during the medieval period. Some argue that women wielded more power than we often give them credit for, especially those who were married to kings or other high-ranking nobles. Others believe that women were largely powerless at court, with their roles confined to those of ornamental figures who played little part in the political machinations of the day. What is clear, however, is that while women at court might have had some influence through their relationships with men, they were rarely able to act independently or exercise their power in any meaningful way. But let's not forget that the very nature of court life, its focus on status, power and image, was particularly harsh for women. You were constantly measured by your appearance, your ability to conform to societal expectations, and your usefulness as a tool for your family's advancement. A woman at court wasn't expected to be a political leader or a strategist. She was expected to be a beautiful, obedient figurehead who could help her family maintain its position in the social hierarchy. For those women who were not part of the nobility but still sought to make their mark at court, life could be even more difficult. Common women had little to no access to the political sphere, and their lives were largely dictated by the men who held power. However, there were exceptions. Some women, particularly those with strong personalities or connections, managed to carve out small but significant spaces for themselves in the world of court life. For example, women who worked as maids of honour or ladies-in-waiting had some degree of access to the royal court, and, through their positions, could wield a small amount of influence. But these women too were subject to the whims of the men who held power. Despite all of this, there were moments when women at court defied expectations and left a lasting impact on history. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, who became one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. Eleanor wielded considerable political power, even acting as regent for her son, Richard the Lionheart, while he was away on the Third Crusade. She was a woman who played a key role in the political affairs of her time, but she was the exception rather than the rule. For most women, even at court, power was a distant dream, constrained by societal norms, gender expectations, and the limitations placed on women by their male counterparts. The constraints placed on women at court were not just limited to politics, they also extended to the very structure of court life itself. Women were expected to maintain a strict level of decorum and modesty, and their behaviour was constantly scrutinised. If you were a noblewoman, every gesture, every word and every action was analysed and critiqued. A simple misstep could tarnish your reputation and bring shame upon your family. You were expected to behave with grace and dignity at all times, and any deviation from this ideal could lead to social exclusion or even punishment. For the women at court, the pressure to conform to these expectations was immense. One of the most significant ways in which women at court were controlled was through the institution of marriage. Marriage was not a matter of personal choice or love, it was a political and social necessity. Women were married off to secure alliances, gain wealth, and preserve family honour. For the vast majority of women, marriage wasn't a partnership, it was a contract. The decision of whom to marry was largely made by the family, often without any regard for the woman's desires or feelings. Women had little say in the matter, and were expected to accept their fate without complaint. At court, marriage was a key factor in maintaining power and influence. A woman's marriage could secure her family's position within the court, and her ability to produce heirs was seen as crucial to the continuation of her family's legacy. Despite the high stakes of marriage, women had little agency in the process. Even when they were married to kings or powerful lords, they were still subject to the whims of their husbands and fathers, their role limited to that of a supportive wife and mother. Despite these harsh realities, women at court did occasionally find ways to assert themselves. Some women, like the aforementioned Eleanor of Aquitaine, managed to carve out significant influence, but they were the exception, not the rule. Most women, even those at court, were forced to navigate a world that was not designed for them. They were expected to support their husbands, look beautiful, and maintain the honour of their families, but their power was minimal and their independence was stifled. Historians still debate the role of women at court in the medieval period. Were they truly powerless, confined to roles that restricted their autonomy? Or did they find ways to navigate the constraints of their positions, subtly influencing the events of the day? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. While women at court may not have had the same level of power as their male counterparts, their lives were far from meaningless. Even within the strict confines of their roles, they made contributions, wielded influence, and at times left a lasting legacy. In the end, The world of the medieval court was one in which women had to balance their societal obligations with their own desires and ambitions. While their roles were largely limited, they found ways to assert themselves, sometimes in subtle and indirect ways, and left an indelible mark on the history of the Middle Ages. We've already explored the realm of medieval court life and the expectations placed on women there, but now let's delve into a much darker chapter in the lives of women during the Middle Ages, their control over sexuality and the society's constant surveillance of their bodies. The medieval world had a complicated, often terrifying relationship with women's sexuality. For most women, their bodies were not their own, and any autonomy over their sexual lives was almost non-existent. Society saw a woman's body as a reflection of her family's honour, and this made women the subjects of constant scrutiny and control. This control manifested in ways that were both subtle and overt, creating an atmosphere of fear and repression that would impact medieval women's sense of self-worth and personal freedom. Imagine this. You're a young woman, perhaps still living with your parents or recently married. Your sexuality is something that is always being watched, always being controlled. If you are unmarried, your virginity is your most prized possession. It's the one thing you're expected to protect at all costs. Your chastity is a reflection of your family's honour, and losing it before marriage would be considered a disgrace, not only to you but to your entire family. Your actions, your dress, your speech, everything is scrutinised to ensure that you're living up to the societal expectations of modesty and virtue. Your every move is dictated by the fear of bringing shame upon yourself and your family. When you marry, things don't get much better. In fact, for many women, marriage meant a loss of control over their bodies altogether. A medieval woman's sexuality, once she was married, belonged entirely to her husband. The concept of marital rape didn't exist. It was assumed that a wife's duty was to satisfy her husband's sexual needs whenever he required it. Your body was no longer just a reflection of your family's honour. It was now a tool for the perpetuation of the family line through the production of heirs. While men had the freedom to enjoy sexual pleasures outside of marriage, women were expected to remain completely loyal and obedient to their husbands. And let's not forget the fear surrounding infertility. If you didn't conceive, it wasn't just a personal disappointment, it was a public failure. You were seen as inadequate, unable to fulfill your most basic role as a woman. The pressure to produce children, particularly male heirs, was immense, and if you failed, the consequences were both personal and social. You might be blamed for the inability to conceive, and your marriage could be seen as a failure. Your husband's family might begin to question your worth, and the gossip surrounding your lack of children could lead to social exclusion and ridicule. But beyond marriage, there was also the ever-present threat of accusations of witchcraft and promiscuity. If a woman was deemed too sexually active, or if her actions were seen as morally questionable, she could easily become a target for persecution. The medieval church had a long history of policing women's sexuality, and it wasn't unusual for women to be punished for even the slightest perceived deviation from sexual norms. If you were accused of being promiscuous, of engaging in illicit sexual relations, or of using contraception, you could be labelled a sinner, a heretic, or even a witch. The church's teachings about sexuality were deeply misogynistic, teaching that women were inherently sinful and sexuality needed to be controlled in order to preserve social order. In medieval society, the concept of purity was also extremely important. Women were expected to be pure in mind, body and spirit, and any evidence to the contrary could lead to severe consequences. A woman who was seen as impure, whether due to a sexual transgression, an accusation of witchcraft, or simply a failure to adhere to societal norms, could be ostracised, imprisoned, or even executed. Purity was the standard, and women were expected to meet it at all costs. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval women had control over their own sexuality. Some argue that women had more autonomy in their sexual lives than is often credited, pointing to examples of women in the higher echelons of society who wielded influence in their marriages and sexual relationships. Others argue that medieval society was overwhelmingly repressive and restrictive when it came to women's sexuality. offered little room for personal expression or choice. Regardless of the debate, one thing is clear: the idea of sexual autonomy for women was largely absent in the Middle Ages. Women were expected to conform to the strict moral codes of the time, and any deviation from these codes could result in severe punishment. But not all medieval women accepted this control without resistance. Some women, particularly those in religious orders, found ways to assert their authority over their own bodies, choosing to remain celibate and devote themselves to spiritual pursuits. Some women in powerful positions were able to exert a level of control over their sexuality, using their influence to shape the social and political landscape of the time. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had a long and tumultuous marriage to King Henry II, used their relationships and sexuality to wield political power. Yet, these women were the exceptions. Most women had little control over their sexual lives, and their bodies were treated as property, either by their fathers, husbands, or the state. The fear of female sexuality was compounded by the medieval church's views on women's bodies. Women's bodies were often seen as inherently sinful, and the church believed that women were more prone to temptation and sin than men. This view was reinforced by religious teachings, which emphasized the importance of virginity and chastity. Women who didn't adhere to these ideals were seen as morally corrupt, and their sexuality was considered a threat to the social order. The church's control over women's sexuality meant that women's bodies were constantly policed, and any attempt to break free from these constraints was met with harsh punishment. Yet despite all this, women did find ways to exert influence over their bodies and their sexuality, even if it was limited. Some women chose to take control of their own destinies by refusing to marry or by entering religious life. Some women used their sexual relationships to their advantage, leveraging their beauty or charm to gain power or influence. And some women simply resisted the social norms of the time, choosing to live their lives on their own terms, even if it meant risking persecution or exclusion. While it's easy to look back at the medieval period and see it as a time of oppression and repression for women, it's important to remember that women were not completely powerless. Despite the control that society, the church, and their families exerted over their bodies, many women still found ways to assert themselves. Whether it was through their sexual relationships, their roles within the family, or their influence in political affairs, women in the medieval world were not entirely silent. Their resistance, even in small ways, shaped the course of history. The struggle for autonomy over their bodies and their sexuality was just one of the many battles women in the medieval period faced. While the overarching power structures sought to control and restrict them, women continued to find ways to push back. Even within a society that placed immense pressure on women to conform to strict norms, there were those who found ways to break free, to assert their power, and to make their mark on the world. Historians still argue whether medieval women were able to exert true control over their own bodies and sexuality. Some believe that women had more freedom in their sexual lives than we often give them credit for, while others argue that the control exerted over them was complete. What is certain, however, is that women in the medieval period had to navigate a world that sought to limit their autonomy at every turn. Their sexuality was not their own. It was a commodity to be controlled, policed, and regulated. Yet despite these constraints, many women managed to find ways to assert themselves and navigate the complex, often dangerous world of medieval sexuality. As we move from the sexual constraints imposed on medieval women to the perilous experience of the plague, it's important to remember that the Middle Ages were a time of constant unpredictability. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the 14th century, didn't just ravage populations. It drastically reshaped the roles and lives of women, adding yet another layer of hardship to an already challenging existence. For medieval women, the plague was not just a deadly disease. It was a harsh reminder of the vulnerability of their lives, their families, and their bodies. And yet, despite the overwhelming loss, women showed incredible resilience, taking on critical roles in society and the family's survival during one of history's deadliest periods. Imagine for a moment that you're a medieval woman, living in a bustling town or village during the height of the Black Death. The air is thick with fear and grief, and you know that the disease is everywhere. It's a time when death is not just a distant concept, it's something that's knocking at your door. You wake each day to find that more people have succumbed to the disease. Friends, family, neighbours, everyone you've ever known is at risk. As the death toll climbs, you realise that survival becomes a matter of luck, not choice. Black death doesn't discriminate. It takes the rich and poor, the young and old. And as a woman, the burden on you becomes even more complex. The women of the medieval world were often expected to care for the sick, manage the household, and deal with the emotional aftermath of losing loved ones, all while facing the constant threat of infection. In many cases, women were left to handle the realities of the plague when their husbands, fathers or brothers were either too ill or already dead. With no men left to run the estates or look after the family's interests, women were often left to pick up the pieces, overseeing the family business or managing the household. This was especially true for women in noble families, who had to ensure that their estate continued to function even if their husbands or male heirs were lost. Some women rose to the occasion, managing their property and wealth with remarkable skill, even though their authority was rarely recognised in the formal social hierarchy. But let's take a moment to consider the emotional toll this took on women. They weren't just responsible for managing estates or caring for the sick, they were also caregivers, tending to dying relatives, comforting children, and grappling with the emotional devastation of watching entire families be wiped out. The sheer scale of grief during the plague was unimaginable. Imagine the anxiety of watching loved ones fall ill, knowing that there was little you could do to save them. In many cases, the women who survived found themselves not only managing the practical aspects of their lives, but also shouldering the deep emotional burden of loss and trauma. At the same time, the plague brought about some changes in the way medieval society viewed women. With so many men dying, women were forced into roles that had previously been off limits to them. Women managed businesses, took on roles of leadership in the community, and became the breadwinners for their families. For some women, this new sense of responsibility provided a sense of empowerment. The epidemic created a temporary shift in gender dynamics, allowing women to step into roles of authority and independence that would have otherwise been denied to them. But while women might have gained temporary power and influence during the plague, it wasn't long before the old social structures were restored. Once the crisis passed, many of the women who had gained authority during the pandemic were expected to return to their more traditional roles as wives and mothers. The temporary shift in power didn't last long, and once the plague subsided, many of the advancements made by women were reversed. For most, it was back to the same rigid expectations of domesticity and submission. The brief moments of empowerment were fleeting, and the return to the pre-plague gender norms was swift and unforgiving. Historians still debate the long-term impact of the Black Death on women's roles in society. Some argue that the pandemic led to greater social mobility for women, providing them with new opportunities and a chance to prove their worth outside the confines of traditional gender roles. Others believe that the brief empowerment of women during the plague was ultimately short-lived, and that the societal structures that suppressed women were quickly re-established once the crisis was over. However, what is clear is that the Black Death had a profound impact on medieval society, and women were an integral part of how that society adapted and survived. In addition to the direct impact on women's lives, the plague also highlighted the precariousness of women's health and well-being. With the loss of so many men, women were left to navigate a world that was both physically and emotionally dangerous. In many cases, women's health, already fragile due to the demanding nature of childbirth and the physical toll of medieval life, was further compromised by the plague. The constant stress, the physical labour, and the emotional burden of watching the devastation unfold all took a toll on women's health. Women who survived the plague were often left with scars, both physical and psychological, that would affect them for the rest of their lives. For those women who managed to survive the plague, the world that they returned to was forever changed. The plague didn't just decimate the population, it decimated social structures, economic systems, and even the way people thought about life and death. In the aftermath, women had to rebuild their lives and their families in a world that had been shattered. And even though they had played such an integral role in survival during the plague, women's contributions were often overlooked once the crisis had passed. The social changes that had briefly given women more power and freedom were soon undone, and the structures that had confined them were put back in place. While it's easy to focus on the devastation of the plague, it's also important to remember the incredible resilience of women during this time. They were not just passive victims of the epidemic, they were active agents of survival. They cared for the sick, managed the household, and kept society running when everything seemed to be falling apart. The Black Death may have claimed millions of lives, but it also revealed the strength and determination of women who rose to the occasion in ways that were rarely recognised or celebrated. Historians still debate the role of women during the Black Death. Some believe that the pandemic represented a significant moment in the history of gender roles, where women were temporarily able to break free from the constraints placed on them by society. Others argue that the plague merely exposed the ways in which women were relied upon, but never fully acknowledged for their contributions. Either way, what remains undeniable is that medieval women, in the face of overwhelming death and destruction, displayed a level of resilience and strength that was remarkable. As we leave behind the era of the Black Death and move on to other aspects of medieval life, it's important to remember that the women who lived through this period were not just passive figures in history. They were active participants in the struggle for survival, shaping the world around them in ways that often went unnoticed but were no less significant. Now that we've examined how medieval women were deeply affected by the Black Death, let's turn our focus to another profound aspect of medieval life: the need to defend the castle. In a world where political power, wealth, and survival often rested on the control of land and fortresses, women were sometimes called upon to defend the very homes that symbolised their family's strength. The castle was not just a residence, it was a stronghold, a symbol of security, and a key element of a noble family's wealth and power. But in times of war or crisis, the castle was also a target, and women, even those relegated to domestic duties, found themselves in roles they never anticipated. Imagine this. You're a noble woman, living in a grand stone castle surrounded by thick walls, high towers, and a well-fortified moat. Life, while often restricted and filled with expectations of grace and obedience, has an element of security. Your husband, the lord of the estate, has many responsibilities, including managing the land, leading troops, and maintaining political alliances. But when war or threats of invasion arise, you, yes, you, are sometimes called upon to take charge in his absence. You're expected to manage the household, oversee the defence of the castle, and in some cases even lead the castle's defence if your husband is away fighting or negotiating. While this may sound like a fantastical or rare situation, the reality is that many women in medieval times, particularly those in noble families, were often placed in the position of defending their homes when needed. The concept of chivalry, which dominated medieval Europe, did allow for some exceptions in women's roles. When push came to shove, their strategic and administrative abilities were put to the test. If invaders attacked or the fortress was under siege, you, the lady of the castle, could find yourself in the role of overseeing the defence. This might mean commanding servants and soldiers to prepare defences, organising food and supplies, and even taking charge of communication with local authorities. There are even historical accounts of women leading troops into battle or commanding fortifications during times of crisis. Take, for example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who, during the Second Crusade, demonstrated that women could take on significant roles in war. While it wasn't typical for women to engage directly in battles, women like Eleanor still wielded power, making important decisions, managing military campaigns, and ensuring that the family's property, including its fortifications, were defended. But such cases were rare, and most women found their role in castle defence more focused on organising the household's resources rather than actually engaging in combat. Let's imagine you're in the midst of a siege. The castle is surrounded by enemy forces, and you're cut off from the outside world. There's no immediate hope of reinforcements, and your only hope is to hold out, endure, and protect the people inside. As a woman, you might be expected to lead this effort, staying calm and decisive, ensuring that everyone knows their role. You'd direct the servants to help with repairs, ensure the troops are well fed, and keep the castle running smoothly under stressful conditions. The stakes are high. Failure could mean the loss of everything: your home, your family, your status. But even with the possibility of danger lurking just outside the walls, the role of women in castle defence was often minimised in the historical narrative. Most of the accounts that survive today focus on male figures: knights, soldiers, and kings. The contribution of women in these turbulent times is often overlooked or downplayed. However, the reality for many noble women was that they had to step up and take responsibility for the defence of their homes, just as much as their male counterparts. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval women were directly involved in the defence of castles. Some suggest that while women played key roles in managing resources and providing support, they were seldom involved in the actual combat. Others point to instances where women like Joan of Arc rose to prominence and actively participated in warfare. However, most historians agree that women were often left to manage the day-to-day affairs of the household and to make critical decisions when it came to protecting their family's interests. They did not typically engage in open combat, but they were still deeply involved in the military strategies that helped maintain the integrity of the castle and its resources. Even in less extreme situations, women often took charge of managing the household's resources when their husbands were away. This might involve everything from overseeing the collection of taxes to managing relations with neighbouring estates and ensuring the supply of food. A woman in this position could become the head of the estate temporarily, managing all the internal affairs and ensuring that everything ran smoothly until her husband returned. As a woman in medieval times, your role as a castle defender, though often overlooked, was an important one. You were expected to hold the fort, both literally and figuratively, ensuring that the home and family's wealth and status remained intact. The psychological burden of such a responsibility was enormous. You were not only expected to manage the daily tasks of running the household, but you also had to shoulder the anxiety of defending the physical and emotional safety of those under your care. The strain of knowing that your castle could be overrun, your family's wealth and status destroyed, was a constant weight. But this wasn't just a role for women in noble families. Even women from lower social classes played critical roles in the defence of their homes and villages. During times of war, when men were often away fighting, women were left to defend their homes from invaders. They might not have had castles to protect, but they often had families, livestock and small holdings that needed defending. Women were sometimes tasked with organising defences, barricading doors, or even participating in the physical labour of protecting their homes. In many cases, women were also responsible for caring for the wounded, both those who'd returned from battle and those who had been injured in the defence of the village. But regardless of social status, the role of women in defending their homes, whether they were overseeing the defence of a castle or a small cottage, was not a simple one. It was a complex, stressful role that required strength, resilience, and tactical thinking. Women had to keep a level head in times of crisis, manage resources effectively, and ensure that their loved ones survived. Their courage and resourcefulness were often overshadowed by the male figures in these stories, but without them, it's doubtful that many families or castles would have been able to endure the challenges they faced. Historians debate the true extent of women's influence during sieges and periods of conflict. Some believe that women were instrumental in defending their homes, while others argue that their involvement was largely restricted to managing domestic affairs during times of war. What remains clear, however, is that women played a significant role in the survival of their families, whether through direct involvement in the defence of their homes, or by providing the necessary support to ensure that the household functioned smoothly under duress. As we continue to explore the lives of medieval women, it's important to remember that their contributions, even in times of war and siege, were crucial to the survival and success of the families they protected. Women were not just passive bystanders in medieval society. They were active participants in maintaining the security and well-being of their families, especially when the stakes were high. Their roles in defending the castle may not have been celebrated, but without their efforts, the social and familial structures of the Middle Ages would have been far less stable. As we shift away from the defensive roles women took on in times of crisis, let's focus on one of the darkest aspects of medieval life for women, the witch hunts. During the Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft were rampant, and women, in particular, became the primary targets of these accusations. The idea of witchcraft was deeply embedded in medieval European thought, and it was largely tied to women's perceived connection to the supernatural, their bodies, and their independence. Whether it was the fear of female power, the desire to control women's bodies, or the link between women and nature, witch hunts represented the extreme dangers women faced when they defied societal norms. Imagine, if you were a woman living in medieval Europe, your life could be at risk simply for being independent or exhibiting behaviours that deviated from the norm. You were constantly under suspicion. If you were a woman who knew herbal remedies, you could be labelled a witch. If you were a woman who lived alone outside of the control of a male relative or husband, you could be seen as a threat to social order. If you were a widow or unmarried, you were even more vulnerable to being accused of witchcraft simply because society saw you as a potential outsider. In a world that was rooted in fear of the unknown, the fear of women with power, whether physical, spiritual or emotional, was palpable. The accusation of witchcraft could come from anywhere. A neighbour who didn't like you, a family member seeking vengeance, or even a priest looking to increase his influence. Being accused of witchcraft meant being subjected to torture, public humiliation, and, in many cases, execution. Women found themselves accused of casting spells, summoning demons, or consorting with the devil, charges that were often fabricated to explain misfortune, illness, or death. The medieval mind believed that women, because of their supposed closer connection to nature and the supernatural, were more susceptible to the influence of evil forces. And if you were already seen as an outsider, whether because of your age, your status, or your behaviour, you were at an even greater risk. One of the most insidious aspects of the witch hunts was that they disproportionately affected older women. In a time when youth was highly prized, elderly women who were no longer able to marry or bear children were seen as threats. Their independence was often perceived as dangerous, as they didn't rely on men in the same way that younger married women did. Their knowledge of herbs, medicines and natural remedies, which was once seen as valuable, could now get them accused of using magic to harm others. The very things that gave these women power, knowledge, independence and wisdom, became the tools used against them in a society that was intent on maintaining control over female autonomy. Even women with no direct involvement in the supernatural could be targeted. If you were a woman who was outspoken, who didn't conform to the expected role of a subservient wife, or if you were simply unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could easily find yourself facing accusations. The social climate in the Middle Ages was one of extreme fear, and accusations of witchcraft were an easy way to explain misfortune, disease, or unexplained deaths. The church and local authorities often encouraged the persecution of women accused of witchcraft, seeing it as a means to assert control over the community and eliminate any threat to the established social order. Let's take a step back and imagine the horror of it all. You're a woman living in a small medieval village and a sudden illness spreads through your family. As members of the community begin to fall ill, whispers start about you, possibly because you are known for your knowledge of herbal remedies. Soon, the whispers turn into accusations, and you find yourself at the mercy of the community. Friends, family members, and even strangers begin to turn against you. The church and local authorities step in, and before you know it, you're dragged before an inquisitor. Torture follows, perhaps in the form of waterboarding, whipping, or worse, all in the hopes of extracting a confession. The goal is not truth, but compliance. Once you confess, whether true or not, you become another name on the growing list of victims, condemned for nothing more than existing as a woman who was different or knowledgeable in ways that threatened the established order. The witch hunts were more than just a reflection of fear. They were a tool of social control. They allowed those in power to rid society of individuals who threatened the status quo. Women who did not conform to their prescribed roles, whether as wives, mothers, or obedient daughters, became scapegoats. The community's fears of death, disease and misfortune were projected onto these women, and they became the perfect targets. The witch hunts represented the extreme consequences of a society that viewed women's autonomy as dangerous and believed that controlling women was necessary for maintaining order. Historians still argue about the exact origins and nature of the witch hunts. Some argue that they were fueled by the rising influence of the Church, which saw women's independence as a direct challenge to its authority. Others point to the social and political structures of medieval Europe, which saw women as inferior and used witchcraft accusations as a way to reinforce male dominance. What is clear, however, is that the witch hunts were a systematic attempt to control women's bodies and behaviours, and they resulted in the torture and death of thousands of women across Europe. In some cases, women fought back. Some managed to escape the horrors of the witch hunts, either by fleeing or by defending themselves against the accusations. But these women were few and far between. The vast majority had no choice but to comply or face execution. Women's voices were silenced, and their experiences were erased from history, buried under layers of fear, shame, and religious control. The legacy of the witch hunts is still felt today. The persecution of women for their knowledge, independence, or simply for being different continues to echo through history. In many ways, the witch hunts represent the extreme end of a social system that seeks to control women's bodies and limit their autonomy. Whether through accusations of witchcraft, sexual repression, or physical violence, women have long been subjected to systems of power that seek to keep them in a subservient role. And while we may no longer face literal witch hunts, women continue to fight against the forces that seek to suppress their freedom, autonomy, and power. Historians continue to debate the role of women in medieval society and the lasting impact of the witch hunts. Some argue that the witch hunts represented a concerted effort to reassert control over women during a period of social upheaval, while others see them as the culmination of centuries of misogynistic beliefs and practices. What is undeniable, however, is that the witch hunts were a tragic chapter in the history of women's rights. They show us the dangers of unchecked fear and power, and the lengths to which society will go to suppress the autonomy of women who dare to live outside the norm. Women, despite being victims of these horrific events, exhibited extraordinary resilience in the face of such brutality. Their bravery, though often overlooked in historical records, is an essential part of understanding the true story of medieval women, one of survival, defiance, and strength, even when the odds were stacked against them. As we continue our journey through medieval women's lives, it's time to turn our attention to one of the more complex and paradoxical aspects of medieval society: widowhood. For women, the death of a husband in medieval times was not just a personal tragedy. It was a life-altering event that could reshape their social, financial, and emotional worlds. But widowhood in the medieval world was not a single, clear-cut experience. It was a mixed blessing, offering both freedom and new challenges, but always under the shadow of societal constraints. Imagine for a moment that you're a widow. Your husband has died, perhaps in battle, perhaps from illness, and you're suddenly left alone to navigate a world that was designed to be governed by men. Your first reaction might be a deep sense of loss, not just for your husband, but for the life that you once knew. You were a wife, a partner in a household, a contributor to the family's well-being. Now, you're thrust into an uncertain future, one where your social status, security, and identity are no longer defined by your marriage, but by your ability to navigate a world without the protection and power that came with having a husband. In some ways, being a widow could offer a woman new freedom. If your husband was controlling, or if your marriage was less than ideal, widowhood could provide the opportunity for autonomy. Without a husband's authority over you, you could potentially manage your own estate, make decisions, and live more independently than you were allowed to before. If you were wealthy or of noble birth, the freedom to control your own property or wealth was a significant advantage. You could inherit land, manage finances, and even negotiate marriages for your children without the interference of a male relative. In many ways, widowhood was an opportunity for women to exert more power and influence than they might have been able to during their marriages. However, the freedom granted by widowhood was not without its risks. As a woman without a husband, your status in society could be precarious. The medieval world was highly patriarchal, and a woman's worth was often tied to her relationship with a man. If you were a widow with no sons or male heirs, your ability to retain control over your property was uncertain. You could be pressured to remarry to ensure that your wealth and land remained within the family, or you might find yourself at the mercy of male relatives who would control your inheritance. Even if you had the power to manage your own estate, the threat of male interference was constant. In many cases, the ideal solution for a widow was remarriage, often arranged by her family or social circle. The need for a woman to secure a new husband after the death of her first one was an accepted norm. Remarriage not only provided emotional and financial stability, but it was also a way to maintain social status. A widow with no family or support was vulnerable to exploitation, and remarriage could offer protection. A widow, especially one from a noble or wealthy background, might be encouraged or pressured to marry a man who could provide financial security and strengthen the family's political connections. But for some women, remarriage wasn't the only option. A widow with resources or status might choose to live independently, perhaps entering a religious life. Convents and abbeys offered a space for women to live out their days with some measure of autonomy, removing them from the pressures and dangers of remarriage. Religious life also offered a measure of respectability, particularly for women who had no desire to marry again. Becoming a nun was, for some, an appealing alternative to the patriarchal structures of marriage and widowhood. As a nun, a widow could continue to live in society, but with a greater degree of personal control over her life. She could manage her own time, engage in intellectual pursuits, and even contribute to the community. Historians still debate the long-term impact of widowhood on women's autonomy and power in medieval times. Some argue that widows were among the most powerful women in society, especially those who inherited substantial property or who were able to negotiate advantageous remarriages. Others believe that widowhood was simply a temporary state of independence, with women being quickly brought back under the authority of men through remarriage or the control of male relatives. The truth is likely somewhere in between, as widowhood was a mixed experience, offering women both opportunity and constraint, freedom and dependence, power and vulnerability. Even if widows were granted some measure of freedom, their emotional and social lives were still shaped by the norms of the time. Widows were often expected to mourn the death of their husbands for a certain period of time, and social expectations could dictate how a woman should behave after losing her partner. There was pressure to remarry to secure the family's interests, but at the same time there was also the fear that remarrying could be seen as unseemly or disloyal. Women faced an emotional dilemma that balanced their desire for autonomy with the expectations of society, which placed a high value on women's roles as wives and mothers. For widows who had children, the pressure to provide for their family was immense. Even though a widow might inherit property or manage her own estate, she still had the responsibility of raising her children and ensuring that they were taken care of. Her ability to keep the family's wealth intact and protect her children's future was paramount, and if her children were young, they would need to be educated, protected, and eventually married off in a way that preserved the family's legacy. This responsibility weighed heavily on widows, who were often expected to perform the duties of both mother and father. Yet, despite the challenges, many widows managed to thrive in this difficult role. Some used their wealth and influence to secure advantageous marriages for their children, while others used their position to amass more wealth or power for themselves. Widows were often able to hold on to their properties, negotiate with local authorities, and even engage in trade or business dealings that would have been inaccessible to married women. The position of widowhood, though fraught with its own set of challenges, could be empowering for those who were able to navigate the complexities of medieval society. Widowhood in the Middle Ages, while often a difficult and heartbreaking experience, also allowed women to step outside the confines of the domestic world and assert some measure of control over their own lives. It was a time when women could, for a brief moment, hold sway over their family's future, make their own decisions, and carve out a path that was not completely dictated by men. Of course, the degree to which a widow could exercise this autonomy depended on many factors: her wealth, her social status, her family connections, and the political environment in which she lived. But the experience of widowhood in the Middle Ages serves as a reminder that, even within a deeply patriarchal society, women were able to find ways to assert power, to protect themselves, and to survive. Historians continue to investigate the role of widows in medieval society. Were they powerful figures in their own right, or were they simply caught in a precarious limbo, struggling for survival after the death of their husbands? The answers are still being explored, but it is clear that whether through their property, their children, or their own resilience, widows were essential to the medieval world and played an important role in shaping the society around them. Now that we've explored the complexities of widowhood, let's turn our attention to a more spiritual and ideological force in medieval life: religion. The medieval church wielded immense power, and while it was a source of solace and faith for many, it also reinforced some of the most oppressive gender roles that shaped a woman's existence. The church held a monopoly on moral and spiritual guidance, shaping everything from how women were expected to behave to the very nature of their relationship with God. But beyond the doctrines of the church, medieval religion also gave rise to a culture that both marginalized and elevated women in different, sometimes contradictory ways. As a woman in the Middle Ages, your relationship with religion would be deeply influenced by your gender. The church dictated how you should dress, how you should behave, and what your duties were in life, both to your family and to God. You were expected to be pious, modest, and obedient to the teachings of the church. Your sexuality was controlled by religious principles that demanded chastity before marriage and fidelity after marriage. You were taught that your primary role was to be a good wife, a good mother, and a faithful servant to your husband and God. The idea of female autonomy or independence, spiritual or otherwise, was anathema to the church's teachings. At the same time, the church provided a spiritual framework that could, at least in theory, offer women some degree of solace or empowerment. The notion of divine grace and salvation was available to all, and many women found comfort in religious devotion. Monasteries and convents offered women a path to spiritual fulfillment that allowed them to escape the confines of marriage and domestic life. Women could dedicate themselves to prayer, study, and charity, finding a place for themselves outside of the traditional roles imposed by society. The convent became a refuge for women seeking autonomy and purpose, where they could make their own decisions and contribute to society through religious service. These women, known as nuns, became important figures in medieval society, not just for their spiritual devotion, but for their intellectual and charitable contributions. Take, for example, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, and scholar. She was a woman who defied the restrictive gender norms of her time, using her religious authority to write treatises on theology, medicine, and natural science. Hildegard's works were widely respected, and she became one of the most influential figures of the Middle Ages, showing that women could not only take a prominent role in religion, but could also be intellectual leaders in a world that often denied them access to education and authority. But Hildegard's story was the exception, not the rule. For most women, the church's influence was a double-edged sword. While it provided a sense of spiritual belonging, it also kept women firmly within the bounds of their socially prescribed roles. Women were not permitted to become priests, bishops, or hold positions of authority within the church. The most that many women could hope for was to become nuns, and even then their roles were limited. Women were often relegated to the roles of caregivers, caretakers, and helpers within the convent, their talents and potential often underutilized and stifled by the patriarchal structure of the religious order. The church also reinforced the idea that women were morally weaker than men. Religious teachings often depicted women as inherently more sinful and susceptible to temptation than men. Eve, the biblical figure, was often cited as the archetype of female weakness, and medieval religious writers frequently blamed women for the fall of humanity. This narrative played a major role in shaping how society viewed women's sexuality, behaviour, and role in the household. Women were seen as morally and spiritually inferior to men, which justified their subjugation in both the public and private spheres. Women were expected to be modest, chaste, and obedient, always upholding the virtues of humility and submission. Any deviation from these ideals, whether in terms of behaviour, sexuality, or social position, was seen as sinful and dangerous. However, it's important to note that the Church did offer women some measure of influence, albeit in limited ways. Women in the medieval period, particularly those of noble birth, could exert influence within religious contexts. They could serve as patrons of churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions, using their wealth to support religious causes. These women were able to express power through their generosity, shaping the religious landscape of their communities. Some even founded their own convents and religious orders, taking charge of the spiritual and practical aspects of monastic life. The role of women as spiritual patrons and donors to the Church was particularly significant during the medieval period. Wealthy women, especially widows, used their status and resources to create religious institutions, providing a space for women to engage in prayer and work outside of traditional marriage and motherhood. While these women still operated within the constraints of their gender roles, they were able to find ways to exercise influence and build communities that were focused on religious devotion and charitable works. But even with this limited power, the majority of medieval women were still confined by the religious doctrines that dictated their lives. Their bodies were seen as inherently sinful, and their primary duty was to bear children, manage the household, and support their husbands in their religious duties. The ideal woman, according to the Church, was one who was obedient, pious, and subservient. Her value was tied to her ability to fulfill these roles and her ability to serve God through her domestic responsibilities. Historians still debate the role of religion in shaping the lives of medieval women. Some argue that the Church provided women with opportunities for spiritual fulfillment and agency, while others contend that it reinforced oppressive gender norms and limited women's ability to participate in the intellectual and political spheres. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is clear. Religion was an essential part of medieval women's lives. It shaped their identities, their roles, and their expectations, providing both solace and subjugation in equal measure. Despite the constraints placed on women by the Church, religion remained a powerful force in their lives. It was through religious devotion that many women were able to find purpose and meaning, whether within the confines of marriage or as members of religious orders. And while the Church's teachings about women were often limiting and discriminatory, they also provided women with a sense of community, belonging, and spiritual purpose that was unavailable elsewhere in medieval society. In the end, medieval religion played a complex role in shaping the lives of women. While it reinforced patriarchal values and limited women's freedom, it also gave them a sense of spiritual identity and purpose. Women who lived within the Church, whether as nuns, patrons, or devout wives, were able to find meaning and influence in a world that often sought to suppress their voices. And even though the Church's teachings were often harsh and restricting, women's resilience in finding ways to express themselves and contribute to society remains one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval history. As we continue through the complex and often oppressive world of medieval society, we now turn our attention to a subject that, while seemingly rare, is one of the most striking examples of female defiance and power in the Middle Ages: female rulers. While the overwhelming majority of women in the medieval period were expected to live in submission, typically under the authority of a father, husband, or son, there were a few women who managed to break through the gender norms, wielding authority, power, and influence in ways that challenged the very structure of medieval society. These women didn't just hold power. They often fought tooth and nail to seize it, holding positions that were typically reserved for men. The idea of a female ruler in the Middle Ages might seem far-fetched, given the overwhelmingly patriarchal nature of medieval society. Women were expected to be obedient wives and mothers, with their lives defined by domesticity, while political power was almost exclusively in the hands of men. Yet, in a world defined by war, inheritance, and dynastic struggles. Some women found themselves at the helm of their kingdoms, empires, or regions, making crucial decisions that would shape the future of their nations. These women were the exceptions, not the rule, but their stories offer insight into the potential for women to wield power in a time when such a thing was considered unnatural. Imagine for a moment that you are one of these women. Perhaps you are a queen, widow, or the daughter of a powerful monarch. Your kingdom is on the brink of war, your inheritance is being challenged, or your family's legacy is at stake. Despite the traditional roles that women were expected to play, you find yourself in a position where you must take control. The power dynamics of your society tell you that women are not meant to rule, yet here you are, poised to lead. This is the reality of women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. Eleanor of Aquitaine, born in 1122, was the queen consort of both Louis VII of France and Henry II of England, and she was the mother of two kings, Richard the Lionheart and John of England. Eleanor's story is one of political manoeuvring, marital alliances, and her determination to maintain control of her vast lands and influence. When Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII was annulled, she married Henry II, and together they controlled a large part of France and England. Eleanor didn't just sit by while her husbands made decisions. She was deeply involved in political affairs, and her decisions had a significant impact on the fate of England and France. At one point, Eleanor even supported her sons in a rebellion against their father, Henry II, a decision that could have cost her everything. Despite the rebellion's failure, Eleanor's influence remained significant, and her role in history cemented her as one of the most formidable women in medieval Europe. But Eleanor's story wasn't unique. Throughout medieval Europe, women like her wielded power in the face of overwhelming societal expectations. Queen Isabella of Castile, for example, became one of the most important monarchs in Spanish history. She and her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, united Spain and expelled the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. Isabella was not just a passive figurehead. She was deeply involved in the political, military, and religious decisions of her reign. She authorized the Spanish Inquisition, a decision that would have profound implications for the country, but she also played a crucial role in supporting Columbus's voyages to the New World, which forever changed the course of history. But what made women like Eleanor and Isabella so exceptional? How did they manage to assert themselves in a world where women were supposed to be silent, subservient, and confined to the domestic sphere? The answer lies, in part, in the unique circumstances of their lives. Both women were born into powerful families, and their royal bloodlines gave them certain privileges and opportunities that most women didn't have. However, it was their intelligence, ambition, and political acumen that allowed them to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics. They were shrewd, calculating, and willing to take risks, qualities that made them formidable rulers despite the expectations placed on them as women. Despite their success, however, these women were often subject to scorn, ridicule, and undermining by their male counterparts. The political power of female rulers was often downplayed, and their influence was frequently minimized. Women who rose to power were often viewed with suspicion, and were forced to work even harder to prove themselves worthy of their positions. The medieval world was not kind to female rulers, and their reigns were constantly challenged, either by other political figures or by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. The idea of a woman holding power was so foreign to the medieval mindset that even those who did rule were often forced to disguise or downplay their authority. Historians still argue whether female rulers in the Middle Ages were truly able to wield power as their male counterparts did. Some argue that women like Eleanor and Isabella were exceptions who had the political skill and support to navigate a system that was stacked against them. Others believe that women were often used as pawns in larger political games, with their roles being limited to symbolic power rather than real influence. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is clear. The existence of female rulers in the medieval period is a testament to the ability of women to defy the societal constraints placed on them and to take control of their own destinies when the opportunity arose. While the stories of Eleanor and Isabella are often seen as the exceptions, They also highlight the potential for women to exercise power in the medieval world. Women who were able to navigate the complex systems of inheritance, marriage, and political alliances had the chance to exert significant influence over the course of history. Even in a patriarchal society, women found ways to assert their authority and take on leadership roles. These women, though often overlooked in the annals of history, played crucial roles in shaping the political and cultural landscape of the Middle Ages. However, for most women, the experience of being a ruler was not a reality. The majority of medieval women spent their lives within the confines of marriage, motherhood, and domesticity. Their influence, if it existed, was confined to the home, and their worth was measured by their ability to perform the duties expected of them as wives and mothers. While the occasional female ruler may have broken through the glass ceiling, for most women, power was something that was beyond their reach. The legacy of medieval female rulers, though, is an important one. Their stories serve as a reminder that, even in a society that sought to suppress women's autonomy and restrict their influence, there were those who found ways to break free and exert power. These women didn't just conform to the societal expectations placed on them, they rose above them, using their intellect, resources, and political savvy to change the course of history. As we look back at the lives of women in the Middle Ages, we can see that their stories are not just ones of submission and oppression. Yes, many women were forced to live within the confines of society's expectations, but there were also women who found ways to carve out space for themselves, whether as rulers, religious leaders, or powerful figures behind the scenes. These women may have been the exceptions, but their existence is a testament to the resilience, intelligence, and determination of women throughout history. As we approach the final section of our journey through medieval women's lives, it's time to look at how the end of the Middle Ages began to change the roles and opportunities available to women. The medieval period was, of course, characterized by deeply entrenched gender roles and societal expectations. Women were generally seen as subordinate to men, with their roles confined largely to marriage, motherhood, and domestic labour. But as the Middle Ages drew to a close and the Renaissance began, profound changes were slowly taking root. These changes, while gradual, set the stage for the evolution of women's rights and opportunities, ultimately leading to the more complex roles that women would occupy in later centuries. Let's imagine that you are living during the late 15th century, just on the cusp of the Renaissance. The world around you is changing. The Church's grip on everyday life is loosening, and a new interest in art, science, and humanism is taking hold. The medieval mindset that had governed for centuries is beginning to give way to ideas that challenge the old norms. For the first time in history, women are starting to appear in public roles outside the confines of marriage and motherhood. The Renaissance, which placed an emphasis on individualism and intellectual achievement, began to offer women opportunities for personal development that were previously unimaginable. One of the most significant developments of this period was the rise of education. Although formal education for women was still limited, some women, particularly from wealthy or noble families, were beginning to gain access to higher learning. This shift was partly due to the increasing importance of literacy, as the Renaissance emphasized the value of education for all members of society, including women. Women of means could now read the works of classical authors, study the arts, and even contribute to intellectual discussions. This was a marked departure from the largely domestic education women received in the Middle Ages, where learning was focused primarily on managing a household rather than developing intellectual skills. The rise of humanism also brought new ideas about the role of women in society. Humanism emphasized the potential of the individual, regardless of gender, and encouraged women to take an active role in intellectual and cultural life. In cities like Florence, some women became patrons of the arts, commissioning works from famous artists and scholars, and using their wealth to promote the development of new ideas. While this was still an exclusive realm limited to the upper classes, it marked the beginning of a shift in how women were viewed in terms of their intellectual and cultural contributions. The Renaissance also brought with it an increase in the visibility of women in literature and the arts. While the medieval period often relegated women to passive roles as muses or anonymous figures, The Renaissance saw the emergence of women artists, writers and intellectuals who gained recognition for their work. Women like Christine de Pizan, the French author and poet, and Isabella d'Este, an Italian noblewoman and patron of the arts, began to break the mould of the typical medieval woman. They were not just wives or mothers, they were creators in their own right, contributing to the cultural and intellectual achievements of the time. However, despite these emerging opportunities, it's important to recognise that the changes in women's roles during the Renaissance were still limited. Women, for the most part, were still expected to marry and bear children, and their access to education and public life remained constrained by their social class. For the vast majority of women, their lives continued to be defined by domesticity, and any opportunities for personal or intellectual development were still largely the domain of the wealthy elite. Historians still debate the extent to which the Renaissance actually changed the status of women. Some argue that the period represented a true turning point, providing women with new opportunities for education, culture, and public life. Others contend that, despite the cultural flourishing of the time, the overall position of women in society remained largely unchanged, with gender roles still firmly entrenched in most parts of Europe. The truth is likely somewhere in between. While the Renaissance opened up new possibilities for a select few, it did little to fundamentally change the systemic barriers that women faced in the larger society. But as we close the chapter on the medieval period and look ahead to the future, it's clear that the end of the Middle Ages marked the beginning of a long and complex evolution in women's roles. The Renaissance may not have been a golden age for women in terms of political power or equality, but it laid the groundwork for the cultural and intellectual developments that would eventually lead to greater opportunities for women in the centuries to come. The seeds of change were planted even if they didn't fully blossom during this period. As we reflect on the lives of medieval women, it's impossible to ignore the sheer resilience and strength they displayed in the face of overwhelming adversity. Whether they were managing households, defending castles, surviving the Black Death, or fighting against the constraints of society, medieval women found ways to assert themselves, carve out spaces of influence, and resist the forces that sought to keep them confined. Their stories, though often overlooked or forgotten, are a testament to the enduring power of women to shape the world around them, even in the face of immense social, political, and cultural barriers. In the grand sweep of history, the medieval period represents a time of great challenge and, at times, great oppression for women. Yet it was also a time of remarkable resilience and quiet defiance. While women were often relegated to the margins of medieval society, they were anything but passive. They fought, they endured, and in many cases they helped to shape the course of history in ways that we are only beginning to fully understand. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, women's roles began to evolve, offering new possibilities for the generations that followed. The women of the medieval period were the foundation upon which future advancements would be built. Their stories remind us that, even in the darkest of times, women have the power to persevere, to challenge, and to transform the world around them. While the road to equality and freedom was a long one, the medieval women who defied the odds set the stage for the progress that would eventually come. As we conclude this journey through the lives of medieval women, it's important to remember that their resilience and strength continue to inspire us today. Though they lived in a world that often limited their choices, they found ways to assert their power, make their voices heard, and leave a lasting legacy. The women of the Middle Ages may not have